Pope Francis signed his Encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, on the 3rd of October in Assisi and published it on the 4th of October 2020. The title of the encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, is taken from the 6th of 28 rules that St. Francis of Assisi gave his friars. This rule reads, "Blessed is the brother who would love and fear his brother, as much as when he is far from him, as he would when with him." Pope Francis sees this as calling for a love that transcends the barriers of geography and distance. The encyclical gathers many of the Pope's earlier statements on fraternity and social friendship. Some of the themes in the document on human fraternity for world peace, which he signed last February with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, and material from letters and documents that individuals and groups sent the Pope. The Pope does not intend the document to be a complete teaching on fraternal love, but to help further a new vision of fraternity and social friendship. The encyclical has 8 chapters. In chapter 1, Dark Clouds Over a Closed World, the Pope paints a stark but realistic picture of today's world. The world seemed to be moving towards integration, with dreams of a unified Europe and attempts at peace in some regions. But this was a shattered dream. Our days show signs of regression, a revival of ancient conflicts, the rise of myopic, extremist, and aggressive nationalism, selfishness, and the loss of a social sense. There are several factors that hinder universal fraternity: globalization, cultural colonization, the deformation of concepts like democracy, justice, freedom, an indifference toward the common good, a throwaway culture, the disparity of rights. The Pope sounds an alarm against a culture of walls, progress without a shared roadmap, a growing gap between concern for oneself and the prosperity of the human family. The Pope bemoans the illusion of communication and notes the many hazards of digital communication. The offshoot: we create only what we want and exclude whatever we cannot control or know instantly and superficially. We cannot ignore these dark clouds, but we must tread new paths of hope. God continues to sow his abundant seeds of goodness in the human family. The recent pandemic enabled us to recognize and appreciate people who responded fearlessly and selflessly to the affected. We need to remember the lessons of the pandemic and change our mindsets and lifestyles. Chapter 2, A Stranger on the Road, is the Pope's exegesis on the parable of the Good Samaritan. The parable takes us to a familiar question: where is your brother? Which we read about in Genesis chapter 4, verse 9. God leaves us with no room to justify our apathy and encourages us to resolve our conflicts and to care for one another. The Pope explains the context of the parable through references to Scripture, indicates the Jewish and Christian tendency to exclusivism, and presents scriptural counters to it. We are called to expand our hearts to embrace the foreigner. In the parable with which we are familiar, only one person stopped, approached the man, and cared for him. He spent his money and gave his time. The Pope analyzes the characters of the parable with a focus on the passers-by. There are many ways to pass by. Retreat inwards, ignore others, be indifferent, or simply look elsewhere. He notes the passers-by were religious. The sign of an authentic faith is not merely worship of God, but a heart open to people. The story of the Good Samaritan is constantly repeated in our world, which ignores others, is indifferent to pain, and refuses to waste time with the problems of others. The parable challenges us to make a basic decision to rebuild our broken world. We need to imitate the Good Samaritan. The Pope calls us to form a community of people who identify with vulnerability and become neighbors beyond historical prejudices, cultural barriers, and petty interests. Chapter 3 is Envisaging and Engendering an Open World. God is love. Since we are part of that love, we are called to universal fraternity or openness. We can live, develop, and find fulfillment only in the gift of ourselves to others. This openness is existential rather than geographical and must include all people. The human family must learn to live in harmony, not uniformity. We cannot be monochromatic. The Pope talks about existential foreigners, persons in need who are abandoned or ignored, and hidden exiles, the differently abled and the elderly. This openness necessarily calls for the affirmation of the intrinsic worth and the rights of every human person. The rights of the individual must be ordered to the common good, and both must include the moral good. We need to pass on values and grow together authentically and integrally. The Pope calls us to solidarity, which is more than sporadic acts of generosity. It means to think and act in terms of community, to give the lives of all priority over the appropriation of goods by a few, to combat the structural causes of poverty and inequality. The Pope calls us to consider an ethics of international relations, because every country also belongs to foreigners, and the goods of the territory cannot be denied to the needy just because they come from another place. Real and lasting peace will be possible only through a global ethic of solidarity with the whole human family. In the 4th chapter, A Heart Open to the Whole World, the Pope argues that migration ought to be avoided through creation of conditions needed for a dignified life in countries of origin. But till this happens, we are obliged to respect the rights of all people to find a place that meets their and their families' basic needs and where they find fulfillment. Our response to migrants can be summed up in 4 words: welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. Closing our doors to others under the notion of protection leads to the simplistic belief that the poor are dangerous and useless, while the rich our generous benefactors. Those who are different from us are a gift and an enrichment because differences are opportunities for growth. We need to be gratuitous, which is the ability to do things simply because they are good in themselves, without concern for personal gain or recompense. There must be a healthy tension between the global and the local. We need to pay attention to the global to avoid narrowness and banality. We need to look to the local to be rooted and grounded. It is impossible to be local in a healthy way without openness to the global and to enrichment by other cultures, without being challenged by happenings in other places. The world grows with new beauty thanks to syntheses produced between cultures that are open and free. Chapter 5 is titled A Better Kind of Politics. The development of a global fraternity requires a better kind of politics, one which serves the common good, which recognizes the importance and the dignity of all people. The truly popular thing is to provide all people with the opportunity to nurture the seeds that God has planted in them, and to help the poor lead dignified lives through opportunities for work. The worst poverty is one which takes away work and its dignity. There is need for a greater spirit of fraternity, but also a more efficient worldwide organization to help resolve the problems plaguing people who are suffering and dying in poor countries. The pandemic has shown not everything can be resolved by market freedom. Pope Francis urges us to rehabilitate politics as one of the loftiest forms of charity, in as much as it seeks the common good. The task of politics is to find a solution to everything that attacks fundamental human rights: social exclusivism, the marketing of organs and tissues, weapons and drugs, sexual exploitation, slave labor, organized crime, and terrorism. The Pope makes an appeal to eliminate hunger and human trafficking. Chapter 6, Dialogue and Friendship in Society. Dialogue is approaching, speaking, listening, knowing and understanding one another. The ability to respect the other's point of view. An option between selfish indifference and violent protest. It is not a feverish exchange of opinions on social media or a stubborn clinging to one's own opinions and interests. The Pope recognizes the danger of relativism, the possibility that the powerful, after gaining the consensus of an apathetic or intimidated population, will deny human rights, and the displacement of moral reasoning, wherein there is no good per se, but only a superficial and bartered consensus. For society to have a future, it must respect the truth of our human dignity and submit to that truth. Dialogue is the best way to realize this truth. The Pope sees life as the art of encounter and invites us to build a culture of encounter. This means forming a many-faced polyhedron, which represents a society where differences coexist, complement, illuminate, and enrich one another, where we recognize the rights of others to be themselves and to be different. Pope Francis calls us to cultivate kindness, which frees us from the cruelty and anxiety that prevail today. A kind person opens paths where exasperation burns bridges. Chapter 7 is Paths of Renewed Encounter. We need paths of peace to heal wounds. We need peacemakers to initiate processes of healing and renewed encounter. Renewed encounter does not mean returning to a time prior to conflicts. It is cultivating a penitential memory, which accepts the past in order to not cloud the future with regrets and problems. Peace is dependent on truth, justice, and mercy. It is not a denial of differences, but involves identifying problems and acknowledging different ways of understanding and resolving them. True reconciliation is achieved by forming a society based on service and sharing, and prioritizing our being human over our belonging to other groups. Peace is linked to forgiveness. We must love everyone, but loving an oppressor means helping him or her to change and not allowing him or her to continue oppressing people. Forgiveness means that we renounce the power of evil and the desire for revenge. It does not mean that we forget. We must remember horrors like the Shoah, the atomic bombings, and ethnic massacres, so that we do not become anesthetized to evil. Society gives two false answers to our problems: war and the death penalty. War is the negation of all rights, a failure of politics and of humanity, a defeat before the forces of evil. Moreover, present-day weapons and their use against innocent civilians preclude a just war. We must vehemently reaffirm never again war. The death penalty must be abolished. It is inadequate from a moral standpoint, unnecessary from the standpoint of penal justice, and inadmissible. Chapter 8, Religions at the Service of Fraternity in Our World. Fraternity cannot be achieved without openness to the Father of all, and without affirming the transcendent dignity of every human person. Religion, or the effort to seek God with a sincere heart, must help us to recognize one another as traveling companions, truly brothers and sisters. The Church must move forth from its places of worship to accompany life and sustain hope, to build bridges, break down walls, and sow seeds of reconciliation. The Pope calls for interreligious dialogue and stresses that this does not involve the watering down of our deepest convictions. It seeks to establish friendship and harmony, and to share spiritual experiences in a spirit of truth and love. We must show that harmony between different cultures and religions is possible. We need to return to the sources of religions and focus on the essential: worship of God and love of neighbor. Authentic worship bears fruit in respect for life and not in discrimination, hatred, violence, and terrorism. These deplorable acts are due to erroneous interpretations of religious texts and policies linked to poverty, injustice, and oppression. The Pope returns to the appeal for peace, justice, and fraternity that the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar and he made together, and calls for the adoption of dialogue as the path, mutual cooperation as the code of conduct, reciprocal understanding as the method and standard. May we read, reflect on, and live the encyclical, and reach out to all people beyond all barriers. Fratelli Tutti. We are brothers and sisters all.